Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 1 of ADO.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about what ADO.NET is, what are .NET data providers. So what's ADO.NET? ADO.NET is not a different technology altogether. In simple terms, you can think of ADO.NET as a set of classes or framework that can be used to interact with data sources like databases and XML files. The data from these data sources can then be consumed in any .NET application. ADO stands for Microsoft ActiveX Data Object. ASP.NET Web Applications, Windows Applications, and Console Applications. These are a few of the different types of .NET applications that uses ADO.NET to connect to a database, execute commands, and then retrieve data and display that data within those applications. Let's actually look at a simple example of how to actually connect to a database, execute some commands against that database, and then retrieve data and display it in an application. So let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have a simple ASP.NET web application, and on this web form let's drag and drop a grid view control. We haven't spoken about grid view control yet. We'll be talking about that in a later session. The idea of this session is basically to give you an introduction to ADO.NET. So let's drag and drop the grid view control, and you can find the grid view control under Data tab. So expand that, drag and drop the grid view control onto the web form, and then you can auto format that to make it look nicer. Let's select brown sugar, click OK. Now go to the code behind file. Now look at this. This is .NET application. Now this .NET application has to connect to a SQL server and execute a SQL command, retrieve data, and display that within this .NET application. Now if you look at .NET and SQL Server, they are two different technologies. Now SQL Server will not understand C# or VB or any .NET programming languages. SQL Server only understands SQL. So from within your .NET application, if this .NET application has to get the data available in SQL Server. Now in SQL Server I have a table called TBL product, and that's present in this sample table. So obviously if the .NET application has to communicate with SQL Server and retrieve data from there, the .NET application first must establish a connection to SQL Server. Next it has to prepare a SQL command and issue that command to the server and execute that. And once you have the results back, display that within the application. So obviously we first need to create a connection. Okay. Now remember, we are connecting to the SQL Server. So all the classes that help me to connect to SQL Server are present in a namespace called system.data.sql client. Okay, system.data.sql client. So first of all I need to establish the SQL connection. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection. Now don't worry about these objects, we will be talking about them in a very great detail in a later session. The idea of this session is basically to understand or to have a high level overview of what ADO.NET is all about. Okay, so obviously to connect to a SQL server you need to tell to this connection object what's the name of the server, and within that server which database do you want to connect to, and what's the user ID and password to connect. So you have to provide that information to this connection object, otherwise it will not be able to connect to the SQL server. So I will have to use data source property, and data source is equal to dot, which means connect to a local instance of SQL server. Database is equal to sample. So if you look at the database here within which we have our table, it's the sample database, and I'm going to specify integrated security is equal to SSPI. Now what does this mean? This means that I'm using Windows authentication to connect to the SQL server. Now again, as I told you, don't worry too much about this object here and about this connection string. We'll be talking about them in great detail in next parts in this video series. Here the whole idea is to get an high level overview of what ADO.NET is all about and what do we mean by .NET data providers. Okay, so I have the SQL connection object. The next thing is we have to prepare the SQL command. So obviously SQL Server only understands SQL. So we have to issue the SQL command from within the .NET application. So let's prepare the SQL command, and to prepare that I use the SQL command object. SQL command cmd is equal to new SQL command, and then we need to specify the command. So select star from TBL product, and execute this command using this connection object. So you have to pass that as parameter as well. Okay, so we have the command. Now open the connection. So I'm opening the connection. Now after you open the connection to the SQL Server, execute the command. So execute reader. This will execute the command and retrieve the results from the database. So once I execute this method, it's going to return the data back in the form of a SQL data reader. So I'm going to store that in a SQL data reader object. Let's call it as RDR. So when I execute this command using this method, look at the IntelliSense. The IntelliSense says it's going to return a SQL data reader object. So I'm storing that results back in that object. And then all I am doing is, we have this GridView1 control. I'm setting the data source property of that control to RDR, meaning whatever data that we have got back, assign that to the data source property of the GridView control. And then finally call gridview1.dataBind. So bind the data, and then finally close the connection. Alright, so it seems so simple until now. Okay, so if you look at this, as I told you, don't worry too much about this code. We are going to talk about every object that we see here in a very great detail in later sessions. Alright, so we are preparing the connection object. Using this connection string, we are telling which database in which server we want to connect to, and then you're preparing the SQL command object, and then you're telling execute this command on this connection object, open the connection, execute the command, whatever result you get back, store that in this SQL data reader object, and then use that data reader as the data source for your GridView control, and then call the dataBind method. So now obviously when we run this application, what should happen? The .NET application should establish a connection to the SQL Server, issue this command select star from TBL product, execute that, retrieve the result, and bind that to this GridView control that we have. And as you can see, the result is here. Now if you notice here, I'm connecting to the SQL Server. Okay, so my backend is SQL Server for this application, for the .NET application. Now, can a .NET application get data from an Oracle database? Absolutely, it can get data from any database. Okay, any database, not only databases, even from XML files, text files, etc. Okay, now we know how to connect to SQL Server. Now how do I connect to Oracle Server? Now again, it's very simple. Now can I use the SQL connection object, SQL command, and SQL data reader objects to connect to Oracle database? No, different databases use different protocols. So obviously there are no universal set of classes that can actually accomplish that. So if you want to connect to SQL Server, you are using the classes SQL connection, SQL command, SQL data reader that's present in this namespace system.data.sql client. Okay, now let's say I want to connect to an Oracle database. Then how do I do that? Now, if you know how to connect to one database, then connecting to another database is no big deal. It's just that you use a different class, different objects. But the concept is the same. You have to prepare the connection object, you have to prepare the command, you have to execute that, and then store the results in a reader object, and then bind that to a control. So let's look at that. So let's say let's comment these lines for the time being. Actually, let me copy those and then comment those lines. So I'm copying them. Let's paste that. Let's uncomment these lines now. So now if I want to connect to Oracle database, all I do is, instead of saying SQL connection, I say Oracle connection. And remember, this Oracle connection is actually present. If I say system.go-to-definition, this is present in system.data.oracle client namespace. Okay, so Oracle connection is equal to new Oracle connection. And instead of using SQL command, as you might have guessed by now, you use Oracle command. Is equal to new Oracle command, because the data source that I am talking to is now going to be Oracle. And again, instead of SQL data reader, Oracle data reader, command dot. Look at this. The exact same code. All I have changed is instead of using SQL connection, I'm using Oracle connection. Instead of using SQL command, we are using Oracle command. Instead of using SQL data reader, we are using Oracle data reader. Okay, and another difference is that this Oracle connection is actually present in system.data.oracle client namespace. So what we can say from this is that if you look at the presentation, data provider, .NET data provider for SQL Server is system.data.sql client, meaning all the classes that will help us connect to SQL Server, execute commands, and then retrieve data back are present in system.data.sql client. And if the database is Oracle, then those set of classes are present in system.data.oracle client. Another common naming pattern that you have to observe here is if it's SQL Server, the prefix that we are using is SQL. If it's Oracle, the prefix for the objects that we are using is Oracle, Oracle connection, Oracle command, Oracle data reader. And similarly, if the data source is an OLEDB data source, OLEDB data sources meaning data sources like Microsoft Access, Excel, etc. Okay, so if you want to connect to them and then get data, you use OLEDB connection, OLEDB command, etc. OLEDB data reader. And those are present in the namespace system.data.oledb. So I can now say, if I want to connect to an OLEDB data source, OLEDB, look at that, OLEDB command, OLEDB connection, OLEDB data adapter. Now what is OLEDB data adapter? Don't worry about that. We are going to talk about that later in this series. Okay. And similarly, if you want to connect to any ODBC data source, you use ODBC connection, ODBC command, ODBC data adapter, etc. Okay, so basically data provider means the set of classes that can actually talk to a specific data source and then provide data to a .NET application. So we can say .NET data provider for SQL Server is system.data.sql client, because all the classes that can help us to connect to SQL Server are actually present in system.data.sql client namespace. Okay, so these are different .NET data providers, and it's very important that we understand these terms, because that makes our communication at workplaces easy. And not only that, when you read some articles on the internet, there's a lot of technical jargon. So if you want to understand those articles properly, it's important that we understand these terms. Okay, so just to give you, if you look at this here, this is a web application, right? We were able to connect to a SQL Server database using web application. Now using .NET, it's not just web applications that we develop. We can develop Windows applications, console applications, web services. There are different types of applications that we can develop with .NET. So all the web applications, all the different types of applications use, if at all, if they want to display data, then they have to use ADO.NET. So it's not just specific to an ASP.NET web application developer. Everybody needs to know ADO.NET. Okay, so here if you look at this, web, Windows console, any type of .NET application uses ADO.NET. Okay, within ADO.NET we know that we have got, let me actually show you an example. Here we have just seen how to work with a console application. I actually have a Windows application that I have just written now, which can connect to a SQL Server. So if you look at this, I have Windows Forms application. In Windows Forms application, we have a control called Data Grid View control. So if you look at the form, this control is the data grid view control that I have dragged and dropped on this form. And if you look at the code behind for that form, look at that. I'm using SQL connection, SQL command, SQL data reader, and then I'm using that as the data source for our grid view control. I'm closing the connection. So whether it is Windows or web, you still use ADO.NET. So when I run this application, see that it's the same data. My Windows application is using ADO.NET to connect to a data source, in this case SQL Server, retrieve data and display it. So no matter what type of .NET application you are developing, if at all, if you want that application to work with some databases, then you will have to use ADO.NET. So any type of .NET application uses ADO.NET. Within ADO.NET, we know there are several objects: connection object, command object, data reader object. These three objects we have seen today, a simple example. And there is also data adapter object. Okay, we'll talk about these objects in detail going forward. Okay, and then there is this data set which is colored differently. Depending on the provider, the connection, command, data reader, and data adapter objects are going to have a different prefix. For example, if the provider is system.data.sql client, then it's going to be SQL connection, SQL command, SQL data reader, and SQL data adapter. If you're going to interact with Oracle database, then you use the system.data.oracle client, which is the .NET data provider for Oracle. Okay, so in that case, the connection is going to be Oracle connection, Oracle command, Oracle data reader, Oracle data adapter. Okay, and the same logic applies for OLEDB and ODBC data providers. But whereas when you consider data set, we don't have SQL data set or Oracle data set. No, it's just data set. Because once we connect to a database, execute the commands and get the data into .NET, we can store that in a dataset object. Okay, in a disconnected fashion. So this is not tied to any provider. In fact, this data set is actually present in system.data namespace. It's not present in the provider namespace. So if you actually go back to our application, so when you say system.data look at that, I can find the data set within system.data set. Okay, so this is not present in system.data.sql client or system.data.oracle client. Okay, it's not provider specific. That's why I colored that a little different. We will be talking about these objects anyway in a greater detail in the next sessions of this video series. Okay, and then these different providers talk to different databases. SQL client obviously talks to SQL Server, Oracle client talks to Oracle, OLEDB to OLEDB, and many other data sources there. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C#, and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.